History often shines a light on empires through their victories, palaces, and monuments, but what remains hidden in the shadows is far more haunting. Behind the walls of power, the Ottoman Empire turned intimacy into a weapon, bending childhood, love, and even life itself into instruments of control. These were not whispers of rumor but patterns written into law, carried out for generations. The wounds left behind did not end with the victims. They scarred families, societies, and memory itself. To uncover these rituals is to face the cost of silence. And silence, history warns us, is the darkest ritual of all. History remembers the Ottomans for empire and mosques, but hidden in their records are rituals that weaponized intimacy. Behind the image of grandeur lay a structured system where sexuality was not private but political. Desire, control, and fear were turned into tools of governance. These practices were not accidents of cruelty or isolated abuses by individuals. They were planned, maintained, and defended as part of the machinery of rule. In the palaces of Constantinople, intimacy itself became a field of power, shaping who lived, who died, and who was allowed to belong. Every ritual, from the selection of boys to the training of women, served a purpose larger than the individuals trapped in it. Through them the empire reinforced hierarchy, kept loyalty in check, and reminded subjects that even their most personal bonds were under watch. What may seem shocking today was, in that world, normalized and written into the rhythm of daily life. To understand this hidden side of the empire is to see how fragile dignity can be when control is absolute. To see how deep this ran, we must begin with the empire's most infamous levy of children. The Div Serm, often called the child levy, was one of the empire's most feared institutions. Ottoman officials moved through Christian villages, mainly in the Balkans, recording every household and selecting boys of suitable age. Families had no choice. Sons between 8 and 15 were the prime targets, though some younger children were also taken. Once chosen, they were torn from their parents and marched toward the capital. The process was not only about numbers but about reshaping identity. The boys were stripped of their birth names, forbidden from speaking their native languages, and required to convert to Islam. Within months, they began to forget the life they once knew. Some were trained to become janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Sultan, cut off from marriage and family, bound only to their ruler. Others showed promise for different paths, their education preparing them for roles in administration or within the palace itself. What united them was the erasure of their past and the demand for complete loyalty to the empire. But not every boy was meant for the sword. Some were destined for darker rituals. The next step in their journey reveals how flesh itself became policy. The making of eunuchs. Among the most brutal practices of the empire was the creation of eunuchs, boys who were forced to undergo mutilation so they could serve in roles no ordinary man was allowed to hold. Many of these children were taken from Africa, others from Europe, and their futures were decided by the kind of operation forced upon them. African boys often underwent full removal, becoming what were called black eunuchs, while European boys were more likely subjected to partial removal, becoming white eunuchs. The operations were carried out in distant provinces, often under crude and dangerous conditions. Mortality was staggering. Accounts suggest that for every boy who survived, many more perished from shock, blood loss, or infection. Yet the empire treated this loss as an acceptable calculation, a grim arithmetic of power. The act itself became a ritual. Only those who endured such suffering could cross the threshold into service. 9 may die for one to serve, yet those who lived held keys to the Sultan's private world. They were trusted to guard the most sensitive spaces, to oversee the palace, and to regulate the hidden lives of women and children. Inside that private world, new rituals awaited. Within the palace, eunuchs became more than servants. They were the gatekeepers of intimacy. They stood as intermediaries between the Sultan and the hundreds of women who lived inside the harem. No message, gift, or movement passed without their watchful eyes. Each day was structured by ritual. Inspections of quarters, enforcement of rules, and the careful monitoring of rivalries among the women. Eunuchs carried instructions from the ruler, but they also maintained discipline, deciding who gained access to privilege and who faced punishment. Their authority rested not only on fear but on the empire's belief that men cut off from family and desire could be trusted to control others' desires. In practice, their presence turned the harem into a place of constant surveillance, where privacy was impossible, and loyalty was measured in obedience. Control over desire meant control over loyalty. But the women themselves were also forced into performances, where survival depended on their ability to turn attention into protection. Life inside the harem was marked less by luxury and more by constant struggle. Young women, often brought in as slaves, were trained as odalisques, instructed in music, dance, and conversation. Their survival depended on capturing the sultan's notice or earning the favor of his household. Competition was fierce, and it was no accident. The system was designed to keep women divided, each striving to outshine the others. In this silent war, every glance carried meaning, every word could shift alliances. Public displays of charm were expected, but humiliation was never far away. A misstep in dance, a poorly chosen phrase, or even a failure to smile convincingly could result in punishment or loss of status. To remain invisible was equally dangerous, as it meant being discarded or sold. In this environment, women learned to wear masks, turning beauty and wit into weapons of survival. Every smile could be a weapon, every gesture a gamble. And some women who failed faced punishments far worse than exile. Punishments within the empire were not only meant to correct behavior but to instill fear. In the harem, women accused of breaking rules of conduct could be beaten, starved, or locked away, while men caught in forbidden relations faced equally harsh fates. Outside the palace, sexual crimes were punished in full view of the public. Executions were staged as moral lessons, turning city squares into arenas where cruelty became spectacle. Crowds gathered not in silence but in noisy anticipation, watching as humiliation was drawn out before death was delivered. The message was clear: desire that defied the empire's order would be crushed without mercy. These rituals of punishment were as much about warning the living as ending the lives of the condemned. Punishment itself became performance. Yet not all rituals were about fear. Some blurred identity itself, forcing young boys into roles that erased the boundaries of gender and turned their bodies into tools of spectacle. Among the most unsettling traditions of the empire were the Cossack dancers, young boys trained to move and perform as women. Selected for their beauty and grace, they were dressed in silks, adorned with jewelry, and painted with cosmetics to heighten their feminine appearance. Their training was rigorous, focused on gestures, music, and allure, ensuring that their movements could both entertain and excite the men who watched them. At feasts and festivals, they performed in front of soldiers, officials, and even members of the court. The surface suggested celebration, but the undertones were clear. These performances carried heavy sexual meaning, and the boys who danced often became targets of desire as well as scorn. Applause could quickly turn into aggression, and what began as entertainment sometimes ended in humiliation or violence. They had no protection from the whims of the crowd, trapped in roles that denied them both childhood and dignity. Laughter and music masked violence waiting beneath. But there were roles even more secret, more terrifying, reserved for those who vanished from records entirely. Whispers within the empire spoke of the Tafsan Oghlan, or bunny boys, children kept in secrecy within the private quarters of powerful men. Unlike the janissaries or the eunuchs, they held no official role, no status, and no recognition. Their existence was hidden, deliberately kept outside the empire's formal structure. Families whose sons disappeared into this shadow world received no news, not even rumors. Records that detailed so much else, taxes, captives, and palace inventories, are almost silent here. That silence itself suggests intent. To leave no trace was to erase their lives, as though they had never been born. What little is known comes from scattered references, often shrouded in secrecy, describing boys taken for private pleasure, their identities stripped away until nothing remained. They existed in silence, lives erased as if they never were. This secrecy was perhaps the most terrifying ritual of all, for it meant there would be no witness, no memory, no justice. Their absence from the record reveals something larger: the empire's economy of desire, where human beings were measured, priced, and traded like goods in a market. Constantinople stood at the heart of a vast trade network, and its slave markets were among the busiest in the world. Day after day, men, women, and children were brought in from conquered lands or purchased through raids and trade routes. Buyers inspected them openly, treating human lives as merchandise to be measured and ranked. Age, beauty, skin color, and origin all influenced price. European captives, especially Greeks and Slavs, often commanded the highest sums, while African captives, though taken in large numbers, were priced differently and destined for other roles within the palace or households. Virginity was another factor, raising the value of young women whose futures were defined by men's choices long before they could make any of their own. Boys, too, were traded, their youth and appearance shaping where they would be placed, some to the military, others to more secret and personal uses. The market functioned as an open display of power, reducing people to commodities. Here, a girl's value was measured in silver, a boy's future in gold. From these markets, the harem and palace drew their lifeblood, ensuring a constant supply of bodies for its carefully controlled rituals. Children born within the harem were not seen as free individuals but as extensions of the system. By law, a child belonged not to the mother but to her master, his status determined from the moment of birth. This meant that infants could be traded, gifted, or discarded like property. Many did not survive at all. Accounts speak of newborns, especially those of uncertain or mixed parentage, quietly killed to prevent challenges to the empire's hierarchy. For those who lived, their lives were tightly controlled, shaped by decisions made far above them. Daughters could be trained for future service, while sons sometimes grew up under watch, their existence tolerated only when politically convenient. Birth, which should have meant hope, instead became another ritual of power. Even new life was subject to the empire's calculus, measured against loyalty and control rather than love or family. And when rituals ended in death, they were not hidden. They were staged, displayed before crowds as reminders of the price of defiance. Executions for sexual or moral crimes were designed to be as public as possible. City squares and marketplaces became theaters where the condemned were humiliated before being put to death. Accusations of adultery, forbidden relations, or other breaches of conduct often ended with punishments carried out in front of large crowds. Families brought children to watch, and vendors sold food as if it were a festival. For the crowd, cruelty was entertainment. For the state, it was discipline. Archaeological evidence supports descriptions of these events, with remains showing signs of mutilation intended to prolong suffering. The body of the condemned became a warning, a living message to everyone present that the empire's order could not be challenged. Each act of violence was both punishment and performance, reinforcing the reach of authority far beyond the execution site. These spectacles were not rare. They were routine, woven into the rhythm of daily life. Yet the true ritual was not in one act. It was in centuries of normalization, where fear itself became tradition. The practices of the Ottoman Empire were not scattered abuses but parts of a system carefully built and maintained over centuries. From the levy of boys to the markets of women, from the training of eunuchs to the staging of executions, sexuality was turned into a weapon of empire. It regulated loyalty, divided families, and reinforced hierarchy, ensuring that intimacy itself was never beyond the reach of power. The most terrifying ritual was not a single act. It was the silence that made it ordinary. Children grew up seeing captives bought and sold, punishments displayed, and survival tied to obedience, until cruelty became accepted as order. These traditions remind us that civilization is fragile, and dignity can vanish quickly when people are reduced to property. Remembering this history is not about condemning one culture alone but about seeing how easily power can corrupt the most private bonds. To forget these lessons is to risk repeating them, for silence allows exploitation to grow again.